Good morning. I wonder, do you ever carry questions that feel too heavy to voice in church? Questions like, where is God when it hurts? Or, why does he seem to bless some people and ignore others? Is God even listening? Is he even real? Steve Jobs, the brilliant entrepreneur and the head and, creator, co-founder of Apple, once carried questions like that. And as a child, he went to church every single Sunday. But when he was 13, something changed. Something shattered his trust. In July 1968, Life magazine published a shocking cover, a photo of two starving children in Biafra during a brutal war. Jobs took this magazine to his church pastor, and he asked, if I raise a finger, does God know which finger I'm going to raise? And the pastor answered, yes, God knows everything. Then Jobs held up this cover. Well, does God know about this? Does he know what's going to happen to these children? The pastor replied, Steve, I know you don't understand, but yes, God knows about that. And that was where the conversation ended. No compassion, no curiosity, no, hey Steve, yeah, that's really tough, let's talk about it. Just certainty and silence. Perhaps you felt something familiar. Maybe you've carried questions that don't feel welcome. In the story we're about to explore this morning, we see something very different. Not silence, not dismissal, not distance. We see a God who invites us to draw near, even when his actions don't make sense to us, even when we're unsure or slow to understand, a God who doesn't shut us down, but welcomes us in. If this is your first Sunday with us, we're really, really glad you're here. Over the last few weeks, as Chris alluded to before, we've been tracing the footsteps of Abraham. Now, Abraham is a key figure in the Bible, and he's often referred to as the father of faith. He was a man who was called by God to leave his home and everything familiar and asked to walk by faith into the unknown. He had to trust in promises he couldn't yet see. We've already seen that Abraham's journey wasn't straightforward. There have been really courageous steps, but there have also been some faltering stumbles. But through it all, we see that something is being formed in Abraham, a deepening friendship with God. In our story today, we see Abraham being drawn into a conversation about mercy and justice and judgment. What he hears stirs something in him that many of us might relate to: tension, confusion, and deep, uncomfortable questions. We've called this message Standing, Choosing to Wrestle. So when Abraham discovers something about God that he struggles to reconcile, he doesn't walk away, he doesn't push it down. Instead, he stands still before God and he asks God his questions. He wrestles, not in rebellion, but in relationship. And in that stillness, something really cool happens. Here's what we'll see. Pilgrimage develops real friendship with God, and real friendship gives you space to wrestle, not pressure to pretend. So over the next few moments, we're going to explore what that looks like in Abraham's story and perhaps what it might look like in yours. We'll look at this in three parts. First, how real friendship with God develops. Second, how that real friendship gives you space to wrestle. And third, how that real friendship removes the pressure to pretend. So let's begin. Pilgrimage develops real friendship with God. Have you ever been entrusted with a question or have you ever been entrusted with something heavy? Perhaps it might be information, it might be responsibility, or it might be decision that felt really heavy when you were brought in. You felt the weight of that. It can be both an honour, but it can also be a burden. And that's where Abraham finds himself. God draws him close and lets him in on something huge. We'll have the key verses on the screen, but if you have a Bible with you, let's turn to Genesis 18. We've touched on the beginning of this chapter in previous weeks. It begins with a moment of laughter and joy. 3 mysterious visitors have come to visit Abraham and his wife Sarah and said they're going to have a baby boy. How good. But now in the story, the tone shifts. Let's pick it up in verse 16. When the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Now that phrase there, looked down, conveys more than just geography. It hints at what's coming. Judgment. Sodom and Gomorrah, if you're not familiar, were 2 nearby cities that had become infamous for their deep corruption. Genesis 13:13 already told us that the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Now, often when we hear the name Sodom or the word Sodom, we think of certain sins, especially sexual ones. But Scripture actually gives us a much broader view. In Ezekiel 16, a little bit further along, God says that the sin of Sodom included arrogance, excess, and indifference to the poor. In other words, not just ancient sins, but rather familiar ones. But this moment in the story, this moment with Abraham, isn't just about how broken a city can become. It's about how God responds and who he chooses to invite into that response. Because after God looks towards Sodom, he turns towards Abraham. Let's look at verse 17. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" And it's quite cool because we're almost hearing this conversation that God is having with himself. And he recalls the covenant and the promises that he's made to Abraham. And he says, Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him, for I have chosen him. Now that word chosen, so beautiful. It's more than just selection, like picking someone in a lineup like we used to do for sports teams. That was horrible. It's relational. God isn't just deciding about whether or not to inform Abraham about what he's going to do. He's choosing to invite Abraham into a deeper friendship. God knows Abraham, and he's chosen Abraham to know him. James describes it like this. Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called the friend of God. How cool, being known as the friend of God. And that is what we see unfolding in this passage, a real friendship. So Abraham's not just being told, he's not just being informed, he's being trusted. Trusted with the heart behind God's mission. Because if Abraham is going to become all that God has called him to be, he needs to know the heart behind the one who called him. And this is what we learn. Pilgrimage develops real friendship with God. So this first part of the story shows us that friendship with God grows through proximity, invitation, and trust. God draws near. He invites Abraham in. He shares his heart, and Abraham steps in to that trust and discovers that real friendship gives us space to wrestle. And that space is exactly what Abraham needs. Because when Abraham hears what God is planning, he's faced with a familiar tension we might know, we might understand. How does a good God respond to a broken world? And that question isn't stuck in Genesis, is it? We ask it every time a child is harmed and nothing is done. A war destroys an innocent life or innocent lives. We ask it when disaster hits the vulnerable hardest while corrupt profit. We ask it when a victim suffers in silence and their abuser walks free, or a diagnosis comes and no miracle follows. For Abraham, it was Sodom and Gomorrah. For Steve Jobs, it was the magazine cover that revealed unspeakable suffering. For us, it might be injustice, tragedy, and unanswered pain, but the heart of the question is the same. How does a good God respond to a broken world? And what's astonishing in this passage is that God invites Abraham into that tension. He doesn't say, stay back, just trust me, I'm God. He says, come closer. Now, we don't see in the passage God telling Abraham exactly what he's going to do, but Abraham knows that judgment is coming. Watch what he does. Abraham approached him, verse 23, and said, will you sweep away both the righteous and the wicked? What a bold question, but not defiant. It's the kind of question that comes in relationship. Abraham knows enough of God's heart to follow as surely you wouldn't do such a thing. Destroying the righteous along with the wicked, why would you treat the righteous and the wicked exactly the same? Surely you wouldn't do that. Should not the judge of all the earth do what is right? Abraham's not just throwing accusations at God, he's appealing to what he already knows of God. He's asking if what he's heard that God's going to do, fits with the God has shown himself to be. In a way, it's a declaration of belief, even with uncertainty. He's not trying to change God's mind, he's trying to understand his heart. This is what friendship looks like. It's not shallow agreement, but reverent curiosity. And so he begins this kind of negotiation. He starts in verse 24. Suppose you find 50 righteous people living in the city. Will you still sweep it away and not spare it for their sakes? Surely you wouldn't do such a thing, destroying the righteous along with the wicked. And God responds, if I find 50 people in Sodom, I will spare the city for their sake. But Abraham doesn't stop there. What if there are only 45? What if there are only 30? 20? 10? He keeps asking, and God keeps answering. Abraham's not tiptoeing around this. He's like, come on, God. He's wrestling. He isn't making assumptions. He's reaching for understanding. And God stays in the conversation every time. He listens and he responds. Until it seems, at the end of our passage, Abraham's curiosity is satisfied. The conversation ends and they go their separate ways. Our senior pastor Jonathan shared a Tim Keller quote with me that captures what Abraham is doing here. Keller observes that this is the question that keeps philosophy professors up at night, that fills Reddit threads, that drives people from faith. How can a good God allow evil? Some conclude God, must not exist. That's the path of atheism. Others say he exists but doesn't care. That's deism. Still others say he cares but can't do anything. That's a limited God. But Abraham shows us a fourth way, wrestling with God rather than writing him off. What if our moral outrage at injustice isn't evidence against God's existence, but evidence for it? Where else would we get this sense that things should be different? Yeah, Abraham doesn't walk away, but he doesn't pretend that there's no tension. He brings it into relationship. He stands and chooses to wrestle. Through his questions, Abraham is trying to reconcile two truths that he knows about God. God is just and God is merciful. He's asking the same kind of questions we ask. Can justice and mercy actually live together? Can the judge of all the earth be trusted to do what's right? What kind of God am I actually following? Maybe you're here this morning and you're still figuring out what you believe. Maybe you're listening online and that is your question. If so, can I invite you to notice how God responds to Abraham? He doesn't shut him down. He doesn't say, how dare you ask, Abraham? I'm God. Or, seriously, Abraham, do you have to ask again? Haven't you got the picture? He stays in the conversation. I wonder if you've ever been round a 2-year-old. You'll know what it's like to be asked why. why? Why? As parents, we get tired, but the child isn't rebelling. They're trying to understand. And that's Abraham here in our story. And God, he's the perfect parent and the perfect friend. He doesn't get impatient. He doesn't shut Abraham down. He welcomes the questions. This is what deep friendship with God looks like. Now, this story encourages me deeply because I used to think that faith looked like certainty, and I judged myself because mine didn't. I had questions, I had doubts, I would read the Bible and God didn't always make sense. And I looked around the church and I didn't see anyone else who was struggling. I didn't see anyone else who looked like they were asking questions. So I felt alone. Like perhaps there was something wrong with me. Like perhaps my faith wasn't even real. But then I read this, and I see that Abraham, the father of faith, wrestled. And I find such comfort in that. And also I find permission. Because the truth is, I still have questions. And sometimes I ask the same question over and over again. And this story gives a beautiful model of where I should go with those questions, to a God who listens. If God invited Abraham into a conversation like this, why wouldn't he invite your questions into conversation too? Abraham didn't walk away thinking his faith wasn't real. He didn't write himself off because he had doubts. And he wasn't met with silence or shame. He was met with patience and presence. And so because of Abraham's story and others like him in the Bible, I'm learning that faith is not the absence of questions. It's the trust to bring them to God. So I wonder, do you bring your hard questions to God, or do you keep them locked up, assuming that they're not welcome? Because real friendship with God gives you space to wrestle, not pressure to pretend. Perhaps for others of us who, by nature or upbringing, aren't natural questioners, can I gently challenge you? Sometimes in our churches, we've unintentionally made it hard to ask honest questions. We've given the impression that doubt is dangerous or that faith means having it all together. That's what I experienced and what some others that I love experienced. And for some of them, the emotion comes, just like it did for Steve Jobs. It contributed to them walking away altogether. But Abraham's story reminds us, God doesn't flinch at our questions. He welcomes them. What if emotional honesty and questioning aren't signs of spiritual immaturity, but signs of desire for deep trust? What if the strongest faith isn't certainty, but staying near even when you feel uncertain? What if maturity looks less like having tidy answers and more like showing up with a groaning faith? Let me ask you plainly, do you want a God who fits neatly into your understanding? Or are you willing to surrender to a God who might offend your expectations in order to transform your heart and the hearts of those around you? Because that's what wrestling does. It unmasks your illusions. It breaks down the tidy categories you once held. And it teaches you to love a real God, not just an idealized one. And this is the deeper invitation in Abraham's story. Not just to question God, but to be formed by the questions. Not just to get answers, but to let that wrestling reshape how you pray, how you trust, and how you walk with God even when things don't make sense. Because when we're in real relationship with God, there's no pressure to pretend that we've got it all together. No need to fake certainty or clean ourselves up first. You can bring your questions. You can bring your concerns. You can bring your confusion. Because real friendship creates space to wrestle, not pressure to pretend. And in that space, we don't just bring our own struggles. We carry others too. People we love, people we don't fully understand, people who can't or perhaps won't come to God on their own. We carry them into God's presence, not because we have all the answers, but because we trust that God listens. That's the heart of intercession. If that word intercession is unfamiliar, it simply means speaking to God on behalf of someone else, standing in the gap. It's carrying someone's pain, their need, their lostness into the presence of God and saying, God, have mercy. If you joined with the Pentecost Prayer Initiative over the last 10 days, you've probably already been doing that. You've been praying for your neighbours or our city or our nation. This passage here is about more than prayer, I think, but intercession is woven all the way through it. Abraham stands in the gap for Sodom, not just for his nephew Lot who lives in the city, but for the whole city. A city that's full of people who likely didn't share Abraham's values, we probably see that, his faith or his way of life, and still Abraham prays. He doesn't look down on Sodom and say, they're pretty much getting what they deserve. He draws near and he steps in. He pleads for mercy. Why? Because friendship with God has shaped Abraham's heart. When you walk closely with God, you begin to carry what he carries. Now, Abraham doesn't pray carelessly. It's not casual, it's not flippant. Even in this friendship, he knows who he's speaking to. His prayers are bold, but they're also reverent. We can see his tone. There's a few times that he comes back to God as he counts down these numbers, and he says in verse 27, now that I've been so bold as to speak to the Lord, or in verse 30, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. It's not performance, it's not manipulation. It's not about saying the right words or convincing God to do something that he doesn't want to do. This is respectful, persistent, vulnerable prayer. The kind that flows from relationship, not from religious obligation. The kind of prayer that says, God, I don't understand everything, but I trust you enough to bring this to you. When we pray like that, we're not just repeating phrases, we're reflecting his heart and we're learning to love what he loves. And maybe that's what intercession really is. It's not polished words, but presence. Not certainty, but trust. Not pretending, but showing up again and again. So let me ask you gently, as I've been asking myself, are you showing up in prayer honestly? Or have you been pretending a little? Saying the right things, but hiding the real questions underneath? Are you willing to pray like Abraham? Not just for outcomes, but for understanding. To stay near enough to God to ask, Lord, how do you see this? And I wonder, if you are someone walking in relationship with God, as many of us are, is there someone that you've stopped praying for? A person, a place, a situation that feels too far gone, someone who doesn't believe anymore, someone who's hard to love, or someone you've lost hope for. Maybe today is the day to start again. We don't pray because we've figured it all out. We pray because we've gone to trust the one who listens. We don't pray because we've got the perfect words or feel especially spiritual. We pray because we don't have to pretend. Real friendship with God means we can bring the mess, the mystery, and the burden. And when we do, we find a heart that welcomes it. So how do we respond to a story like this? Abraham stood before God, not with perfect understanding, not with polished prayers, but with honest friendship. He stood because he had drawn close. He spoke because he had learned to trust. He wrestled, not because he lacked faith, but perhaps because he was secure in it. And as we've explored his story, we've asked some important questions, like what if friendship isn't about certainty? What if spiritual maturity isn't tidiness, but trust? What if God doesn't expect us to have it all figured out, but simply invites us to stay close? That is the invitation to a friendship with God that welcomes the real you, to a faith that can groan and question and plead and still stay. Because the truth is, this journey with God isn't always linear. It won't always be tidy, but it can be real. We've seen that real friendship with God develops over time through invitation and trust. And we've seen that it creates space to wrestle without fear or shame. We've seen that it removes the pressure to pretend, even when we're praying bold prayers for others. So like Abraham, you're invited to draw near, to speak honestly, to pray boldly, and to stand in the gap, even without the answers, all the answers. And if your picture of God was shaped by a moment like Steve Jobs, a moment when your questions were dismissed or met with silence, Abraham's story offers a different vision. A God who doesn't shut you down. A God who stays in the conversation. A God who welcomes you closer. Let's be people who respond to that invitation. Let's stand and choose to wrestle. As we close, I just want to take a moment to connect the heart of this message to the bigger God story. Abraham could ask the questions. He could stand in the gap, but he couldn't carry the full weight of the world. What Abraham glimpsed, just that little bit, the mysterious tension between justice and mercy, we now see more clearly through Jesus Christ. Centuries later, well after Abraham had gone, another intercessor would stand before God, not just asking for the righteous to be spared, but offering himself as the righteous one so the guilty could be saved. He didn't just ask, can the righteous save the wicked? He became the righteous one, and he was the righteous one, and he gave himself to save the wicked. His name is Jesus. And on the cross, justice and mercy met. Justice, because sin is taken seriously. It isn't ignored or swept aside. Mercy, because rather than destroy us, God chose to step in and rescue us. Jesus didn't negotiate with God like Abraham did. He became the answer to Abraham's deepest question. Can the judge of all the earth be just and still show mercy? Yes. In Jesus, yes, he can. Yes, he does. Because we don't just long for a just world, we also long for mercy in our own lives. And Jesus meets us in both. Such good news. And here is what it means for each one of us. Jesus now invites you into real friendship, not just belief, not just obedience, friendship. The kind that welcomes your questions, that stays when you struggle, that gives you space to wrestle without pressure to pretend. Abraham was called the friend of God, not because he got everything right, but because he kept walking, kept asking, kept trusting. That same kind of friendship is what Jesus offers to you today. Maybe you've already accepted that offer. Maybe you're not yet sure what you believe. Wherever you are, the invitation still stands, because God always moves first. He draws near even when we don't understand, even before we understand. Just like he did with Abraham, he still asks, shall I let them in on what I'm about to do? And he still says, yes. In John 15:15, we see Jesus' words, I no longer call you servants. Instead, I call you friends. And then he says, everything that I've learned from the Father, I have made known to you. He's let you in. He's chosen you. He's invited you close. So now we're going to take a moment to respond. The team is going to play quietly for a while and then we'll sing together. There will also be people up the front here available to pray with you. But before that, I wonder, and I just want to invite you to take a moment just to be honest with God. This is a moment for real friendship. Maybe for you, this is a moment to trust Jesus for the first time. Maybe it's time to bring your questions and trust that he's not going to turn away. Or maybe it's time to start praying again for someone or something that you'd given up on. Whatever it is, Jesus is inviting you close. You don't need perfect words, just honesty. And if you'd like someone to stand with you in that, come forward. We'd love to pray with you. Now let's stand before God, just as Abraham did, and choose to bring whatever is on our hearts. Because of Jesus, we are invited into real friendship with God. And that kind of friendship gives you space to wrestle, not pressure to pretend.